we wanted to do the cold open about this relatively unexpected news about the Snyder Cut finally becoming a thing. And I know that we're going to go over on this, so we'll just we'll tease you guys with it, with some talk about the Snyder Cut, and then we'll do our intro, and then we'll come back and do a slightly longer segment on it after the intro. But I'm honestly surprised that this happened at all. Were you as surprised as I was, or did you think it was an inevitability?
I definitely think it's a surprise. I think this whole quarantine thing has just made everyone gone crazy.
Yes. Yeah.
And I feel like this might be a reason why it got greenlit. At the same time, I'm impressed that public opinion can sway a movie studio this much for them to spend 20 to 30 million and then basically craft a whole new project.
Yeah. And for the people listening who have no idea what we're talking about. So basically a couple of days ago, before we're recording this episode, Warner Brothers and Zack Snyder made the announcement that they're going to be returning to the movie Justice League, which came out, when was it? 2017? Which was completed in a rather difficult time when the director at the time, Zack Snyder, was dealing with a personal tragedy. He had to leave the project. Joss Whedon, who has also worked in superhero cinema, but for Marvel and other places, came in to fix the project, did some reshoots, did some rewriting, inserted some material that is more his style of movie making, and the finished product felt like it was being pulled in two different directions. And now in the years since, there's been this movement with this weirdo kind of group of comics fans to
weirdo group
to give Zack Snyder either a platform to post the unfinished cut of the movie, realize his vision, or actually. And this is probably the least likely situation, but the one that we ended up getting, give him the money to finish it and complete all the visual effects and, all of that. And that's what we're going to get. So come on back after the intro. We're going to get into it. I'm definitely not as psyched about this as Jason is. And we might get some interesting conversation going.
Welcome to the 75th episode of the Extra Buttery Podcast, a free-flowing conversation between two guys who love TV and film. In this episode, we continue our discussion about the Snyder Cut, the director's cut of the much-maligned Justice League, the Lovebirds, Kumail Nanjiani's new romantic comedy, Capone, director Josh Trank's biopic about the Prohibition-era gangster, Trip to Greece, the fourth film from Michael Winterbottom, based on the popular British sitcom series, and finally, Netflix's new documentary series, Trial by Media. So, jumping back to the Snyder Cut, why are you not as psyched about it as me? Because I think either way, this is going to be super exciting because it's either going to be a train wreck or it's going to be at least a better version of a film that we feel, some fans feel deserve they needed.
Well, I'll say that I'm conflicted about it because I recognize that there is some value in letting a director return to a project that, was interrupted through no fault of his own and letting him kind of see it through to completion, right? I think any artist, whether you're working in movies or TV or, visual arts or music, whatever, if you get cut off from finishing something and you've got a really strong idea for it, it's always good to see people be able to come back to it, even if it's years later and, finally knock it out, whether it's good or bad. But for me, I'm already not a huge fan of Zack Snyder, so
noted.
I don't, and it's not that I hate him as much as I dislike some other directors out there, but I've just never been totally sold on his vision for these characters. And I don't know, I'm skeptical about how, even seeing through some of the kind of left field choices that he's been reported to have envisioned for this movie, I don't know if it's going to really fix the movie. And we'll get into that in a minute. The other thing that really makes me conflicted about it is it feels like Warner Brothers to a greater extent and Zack Snyder to a lesser extent have kind of been badgered into doing this by the fans. The fans decided that Justice League was a bad movie, even though I actually liked it quite a bit more than Batman v Superman and even Man of Steel to an extent. They decided that it wasn't good. They decided that it had, you know, the jokey stuff that Joss Whedon brought in was too jokey and too silly, and that somehow, you know, Snyder had been robbed, and so the great, pardon the pun, an injustice had been done, and you know they had to rectify this. You know, the fans were right, and I don't know, in the climate of like, you know, toxic fan bases in Star Wars and other places, I don't always like seeing the mob mentality kind of circle around and kind of make something happen like that. So
it's interesting because Warner Brothers, to me, with the way they've handled the DCEU, has always been reflexive. So the Dark Knight series comes out, they're like, okay, superheroes need to be dark. And then Marvel kind of goes down like a sort of jokey path. And then they're like, okay, so Suicide Squad can't be all dark. It has to have some humor in it and some like off the wall, offbeat kind of angle to it. And then now with Justice League, now they're saying, okay, all right, well, if this is what you want, we're going to do it. I think there is something charming in that sense, in the fact that they kind of want to give people what they want, but they also don't know how to craft it properly into something that people will like, which is like the biggest dilemma. They're circling back around and they're fixing things after the project's already been started. They did that with Suicide Squad with very shoddy results. And they're doing it again here. Yeah, keep in mind, Suicide Squad is getting a sequel called The Suicide Squad. Yeah, like they're completely starting from scratch again with that, reusing some of the original cast and recast and, you know, cutting out other characters whose, you know, performers are busy with other projects. Will Smith. Right. And I think one of the biggest points to point out, too, is that Marvel, I think you can see the progression where they become better and better at what they do. With DCEU, it seems like it's either hit or miss. So they have huge misses with Zack Snyder. They get a huge hit with Wonder Woman, and then moderate hit with Aquaman, and then they go back to like mediocre stuff. And it's like, even after all these films and this entire process, they still can't figure out what makes a good film. Yeah. At the same time, though, because this is returning to Zack Snyder's original vision, you kind of hope that it is something that feels a little more together. One of the biggest problems with Justice League is that it really, really felt like two people directed this film. Part of me wonders, like, by returning it to Snyder and letting him deliver the version that he wants, like they're going to be going back to that dark stuff again. And you're right, like the tone will be consistent, but I think one of my biggest gripes about Snyder's work in general through several of the DC films and even like, you know, Watchmen and 300 is that, well, 300 less so because he was kind of doing the pretty direct adaptation of the comic. But anyway, he has too many plot threads is the main problem I have with him. He spends way too much time jamming his movies with ideas, which are all individually valid, but he doesn't really take time to build arcs or develop his characters or have his characters learn anything over the course of a movie. That was the biggest problem with Batman v Superman. Any character decision felt like it was coming out of nowhere, was not properly built up. And I worry that, you know, all of the strange ideas that he's tossed out on over the years on social media about what he wanted to do with Justice League, it feels like it's just going to be that all over again, where he crams it full of ideas that are all inspired from very well respected comics. But I feel like the whole thing is just going to feel overstuffed, and it's not, you know, the characters are not actually going to progress at all by the end of it. So this is where I think DC really suffers from not having a Kevin Feige-like dude. Yeah. Because I think the Marvel films are stuffed with a bunch of stuff, but it's just more neatly planned out and everything's kind of sprinkled with purpose. Yeah, that's a good point. With DC, it seems like they don't know if there's going to be a next film, so they might as well try and cram everything into it, just kind of like Doomsday and Batman v Superman, where you could have had a sequel and introduced Doomsday as the main villain rather than being, you know, this sort of like weird monster that appears out of nowhere in the second act. I think this can go sort of three ways. So the first way is that Zack Snyder pulls off his vision and it is somehow, and I think this is most least likely to happen is that somehow it's a critical darling. Not in the sense that it's going to win like any major awards, but that it is clearly a good film, objectively a good film.
Right. And an improvement over the original.
Exactly. So the second one is a marginal improvement where like, yeah, I mean, everything is there, but at the same time, it's still executed poorly. I think this is kind of where I kind of have my expectations at. The third option is that it does actually worse than the original Justice League. And people are wondering, well, why did we even spend this much money and all this internet noise trying to get the Snyder Cut when the end product is still just as bad or worse than the original? Where kind of are you on that though? Because we won't know until it comes out.
Yeah, it's like 2021. And
yeah, and to be fair, Zack Snyder has interesting ideas. It's always how he ties it together.
Yeah.
I do think his ideas are kind of niche because I feel like if you read some of the stuff he posts on the internet, you really have to be like a DC comic book fan to understand some of the references. Like a lot of the stuff he pulls are straight from the comic books or straight from that universe. But if you don't know what the mother boxes are instinctively, and it's not your niche, you're not going to really understand all the messages he's trying to cram in there.
Yeah, and he doesn't mediate it the way, like you were saying, Kevin Feige has rather expertly kind of made some very complicated comics arcs palatable for a general movie audience. That's really one of Marvel's geniuses. I mean, if you try to come into comics without even watching any movies that are based on it, it's easy to get like overwhelmed really quickly. Just the sheer number of like different storylines and the weird characters and the complicated timelines and everything. It's a lot to take in, and Disney and Marvel have done a really good job of like distilling that into one kind of thread or several interlocking threads that people can very easily digest. But DC kind of, and partially because Snyder is such a nerd, he just kind of gives people like the raw stuff. And but then to circle back to what you were asking, like I think when the conversation about the Snyder Cut first got started, people were like, a lot of people who were in the know about Hollywood figured that it was like never going to happen because, at the current state it's in with unfinished VFX, it wouldn't be very watchable at all if it was released as is. So someone would have to put up the money to make it watchable. Otherwise you would just get like a fully finished scene that you recognize from the original movie and then like a shot of like the actors on a green screen or, an animatic of like hand sketched out characters from a storyboard. It just wouldn't be. It would be like a geek's paradise, but it wouldn't work as a final movie. So the fact that Warner's is putting up the money, I think it's interesting from a business perspective, because even if it's only a marginal success or even a failure, like it's worse than the original, they already have all of this word of mouth going now that they desperately needed, because if they're launching HBO Max as a competitor to Disney Plus and Netflix and all the others out there, they need a like flagship series to bring in people to convince them to sign up for a membership on day one. And, if these Snyder Cut fans are, they're the types of people to buy expensive billboards at Comic Cons and, do all the online campaigning. I mean, I would say that the Warner Brothers brass were probably like, they looked at that and they were like, hey, we need people to come to this service. So why not activate these people?
That's an interesting point. So the final thought I have on this before we move on to the movies is that this new Snyder Cut Justice League could easily be a 4-hour movie or a 6-episode miniseries.
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting concept. The fact that the 4-hour movie could exist doesn't interest me at all. I think that's just too much Snyder in one sitting.
Yeah.
Even like, I like The Watchmen, and even then I felt the extended version you have to have some patience to sit through it. I don't know if I have the patience to sit through a 4-hour Justice League movie that I know won't be like blowing my mind away, because for the most part we've seen what's in it. But the miniseries does interest me, and I wonder if at some point, since we already have live action superhero series on like the CW and stuff, why wouldn't a company like Warner Brothers or Netflix, which they have done already, throw serious money at like a DC or Marvel TV series? And I think this is like the new frontier, right? Because all the other stuff is coming on Disney Plus as well.
Yeah, well, and you think about the economics of it again, like one of the things that's made The Mandalorian on Disney Plus more viable as like a regular show is the way they shoot it with this kind of dynamically adjusting screen behind the main characters. That's something that had to be developed for that show, and it's made it possible for them to have like movie quality special effects in a regularly released TV show. And they had to work that out to make it the Star Wars fans who were coming into it to kind of sell them on it. Otherwise, they might have seen it as kind of like a low rent version of their favorite movie franchise. So,
right.
In the presence of technology like that, if Warner Brothers leveraged something like that, maybe they could make something that looks to be on the same kind of production quality as the Justice League movies that we've gotten so far, but do it in a format that maybe, lets Snyder and his collaborators kind of breathe a bit with the way they want to tell the story.
And I think with the way like so many of his storylines are kind of episodic, I think it really translates well to TV if you can break it into chunks.
Yeah.
And if this is successful, let's not forget Warner Brothers back in like the 90s and 2000s did a really good job with the Justice League cartoons. I don't know if you remember them.
Oh yeah.
They were actually really good. So maybe there is sort of like a second life of Justice League on streaming as a miniseries rather than theatrical films, and maybe reserve the theatrical films only for like the one-offs, like featuring one character like Wonder Woman or whatever it is.
Yeah. They might just have to totally shake up their approach. And I mean, anything to keep Zack Snyder from making big screen adaptations of Ayn Rand novels, because he was also tossing that around, and that sounds terrible.
Anyway, enough talk about Zack Snyder. We won't know until we know anyway, so that'll be next year.
Yeah, it's a real like trial by fire for sure. But talking about all projects that have kind of been saved by streaming, there's this romcom that's come out this past weekend when we're recording this from Kumail Nanjiani and Issa Rae on Netflix that was originally going to be like a standard studio comedy release, but the coronavirus pandemic has pushed it direct to streaming.
This is the Lovebirds, which is about Kumail Nanjiani and his girlfriend who witness a murder, are somehow involved in this grisly murder by chance and circumstance. And it kind of, they go on this like chase to figure out who the person they killed is, who the murderer is. At no point do they ever really, I think, do anything that's logical. It's kind of like two people running around with their heads cut off with a couple one-liners here and there.
He's fucking dead.
We know he's dead, but we didn't kill him.
He'd like to report a murder or whatever.
We didn't murder anybody.
1, 2, 3, go.
No. Jabron!
Okay, the guy's name is Jabron.
Run, Leilani.
And the girl's name's actually Leilani. She's running too now. Kind of slow, like she's wearing heels that look actually amazing.
If you think about the movie Game Night, but maybe 10 times worse.
Yeah.
This is what you have. I got to be honest, I didn't find this movie really funny at all. There was one time I laughed, and it may have been when Issa Rae was slapping around the frat boy, or when Kumail Nanjiani is kind of going on tangents. When he has this thing where, like, if someone asks him like a really simple question, he'll just answer it the totally wrong way and then just say, "I'm joking."
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of his like ticks, like a nervous tick kind of thing.
Exactly. The thing is, though, I feel like I've seen this movie somewhere, just done way better. I thought the characters were kind of flat.
Yeah.
The plot didn't really move me at all. Like, it was kind of hard for me to sit on my couch and not throw something at the screen and just say, like, why can't you guys just like sit down and talk to like an adult about this? Because you really sound like 12-year-old kids just arguing at each other. And like the film even makes a point of calling them an annoying couple, which I don't know if it's like too self-referential or too self-aware to be funny. It actually just kind of made my blood boil a little bit.
Yeah, well, one of the comparison you made to Game Night, which was a Jason Bateman, Rachel McAdams movie from a couple of years ago, that particular movie is a good comparison because that's an example of like, you take these like normies who are having like a regular old life and, the movie thrusts them into an escalating series of events and things just get crazier and crazier. And then eventually, they end up drawing on some sort of like inner strength to kind of bond and solve the problem, But the thing that Game Night had that the Lovebirds doesn't is first of all, a much sharper script, but it had a network of supporting characters that all sort of bumped off of each other and created little mini dramas over the course of the story. So you had the weirdo neighbor played by Jesse Plemons, who's like a cop with an obsession over his little white dog. There's the older brother character played by Kyle Chandler, the dumb friend, and the sort of romance that the dumb friend gets into with the older woman, and there's just like that. There's so much mania created by all of these characters bouncing off of each other that you're never bored. There's always something happening. And the Lovebirds kind of aims for that level of like a crime caper kind of thing, but it doesn't have any of the characters or any of the scenes to really like let Nanjiani and Ray kind of do their thing. There's this one scene where they're briefly threatened by a congressman and congressman's wife.
Yeah, that was a weird scene.
It felt like it was a setup for something, but the Nanjiani and Ray's character escape and, they carry on with their journey. But you'd think that they would circle back around and have another scene with those two characters so that there could be a better payoff to those characters, because Anna Camp, and I think it's, what's the other guy's name? He's from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He plays like Amy's ex-boyfriend on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. And those two actors, they're quite funny people. So I know that they could have had a great scene with Nanjiani and Ray, but it's just not there. It feels like half of the jokes got cut out of this thing after like a bad test screening or something.
Yeah. So at the end, that couple, Anna Camp and her husband, actually kind of make a cameo, but nothing about the characters change. I think the one thing that Game Night really has going for it that the Lovebirds doesn't is that the characters of Game Night are really compelled to solve the mystery themselves.
Right.
For the Lovebirds, Kumail and Issa Rae, their characters, their logic behind trying to solve the mystery itself never really sticks. So they're of the mind that they're unwittingly involved in this murder, and rather than go to the police, they're going to try and solve the mystery themselves to clear their name themselves, which is just kind of weird because, spoiler alert, at the end, they do actually come in contact with the police, and the police kind of like pop their balloon and be like, yeah, we know you guys were never suspects.
Yeah.
Like, that's just impossible. So it kind of negates their whole reason to chase after the murder and solve the mystery themselves. At least with Game Night, there was good reason for them to get involved because they had hired this guy to pretend to be a murder victim, but ended up being really a murder victim.
Yeah, exactly. So there's
like this like force that moves the characters and forces them to do things, to do outrageous things, rather than just doing things because we need to get from point A to point B in this movie. I gotta say though, like the opening scene of the Lovebirds is, I think, one of the few scenes where you get two characters arguing about nothing for like 5 minutes, and it doubles as like an exposition dump.
Yeah.
And like a character sort of like reveal moment. But I don't think it was very effective because the things they argued about, I really didn't care about. It was almost all for that payoff scene at the end, right before the characters, when they go on the amazing race.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very long setup for that one joke right in the middle of the credits or whatever.
Was it worth it?
Not really. I mean, I'm coming in at like a 3 out of 5 on this thing. Like I like.
Yeah, I went lower too.
I like Nanjiani. I like Ray. I like them as actors. I'd be really curious to see how this movie would have changed if Nanjiani and Ray had written it themselves, because I know that they're both talented writers, and they're working with the guy who directed Nanjiani in The Big Sick, which was something that Nanjiani wrote with his wife Emily V. Gordon and was nominated for an Oscar. So we know that they're very talented people. It's just what they were given to work with here was not great.
Yeah, Nanjiani he's sort of become one note in these romantic comedies in that he almost plays the same character. Like he plays this Pakistani immigrant who has a lot of baggage.
Yeah, he's like neurotic and
Very neurotic, very much a nerd.
Where I'm kind of landing on it is there's worse things to watch during quarantine. There's it's only 97 minutes, so it's not going to suck up a huge amount of your time. If you like these people, then it's inoffensive. But there's like, if you can see Game Night or any other movie of that caliber, I would go to that first.
Yeah, I struggled with this. I didn't really enjoy it, actually. Like, bottom line. What I did enjoy more, though, is Capone. This is Josh Trank's new biopic about Al Capone, the Prohibition era gangster, also known as Scarface, played by Tom Hardy.
Do you know what the difference is between Adolf Hitler and Al Capone? Hitler's dead. Capone lives like a king in Florida.
He has full-blown dementia.
I have reason to believe that could all be an elaborate act.
What's this about?
We have information that your client may have tucked away a very large sum of money.
Can we call his performance mumblecore? He has this thing where he mumbles, but it's really hardcore because he always plays like really hard edge characters or gangsters. But then he mumbles and growls through his entire performance, and it's kind of like fitting to call it mumblecore.
Yeah, well, I like that because, traditionally mumblecore is a reference to like, small budget indie movies that have like...
Which this kind of is.
Well, yeah, it's this small budget indie movie, but it tends to focus on like like the characters are like artistic people living in the city with like romantic problems, and they kind of like mumble their lines, and it's all done with
they're hipster films.
Yeah, hipster films. And I know that mumblecore is a term that the people involved in that community, like the Duplass brothers and
Greta Gerwig
and other filmmakers like that, they don't especially like the label. So I'm sure, if you could get everyone in film Twitter to buy in on the idea of calling Tom Hardy's work mumblecore instead, you might get a surprising amount of buy-in. I don't know.
Well, wouldn't that be how you describe Tom Hardy's performance in this? Because we should talk about his performance a little bit.
This movie is depicting Al Capone after his 10-year stint in prison. Infamously, they got him on tax evasion and not on any of the murders or crimes that he committed when he was at the peak of his power in Chicago. But while he was in prison, his syphilis caught up with him and caused this like severe physical, mental degradation. And when he's finally released from prison, mostly because the feds assume that he doesn't have very long to live, he goes down to this mansion in Florida and, flails out his final year. And that's where this movie picks up. So Tom Hardy is kind of like, he's dealing with a version of the character who can barely speak. He kind of croaks out this sort of combination of like Italian insults and also just sort of barely understandable croaks. And it's
a lot of grunting and yelling. At one point there's movers outside his house just moving stuff.
Yeah.
And then there's one guy he doesn't recognize. And the next thing you know, he's like jumping out of his chair, waving his cane and just yelling and tapping on the glass like he's some sort of madman.
Yeah.
And he's not trying to say anything. He's just like yelling.
Just raging.
And it's supposed to be, and it's supposed to be like an interpretation of him kind of losing his speech because he kind of suffers a stroke midway through, and it's about his body failing him and his mind failing him. I thought that was really funny. Have you ever heard like the actual voice of Al Capone though? Because one of the things that really bothered me was that Tom Hardy doesn't sound like the Al Capone that I know.
Yeah, like I haven't heard any recordings of Capone's voice. I mean, I've seen...
It's a little more high pitched, and Tom Hardy has the growl. Yeah.
Okay, so I've seen depictions of him, and like Robert De Niro famously played him in The Untouchables, and so there's been a few actors who've all given their kind of stamp to it.
It's distracting. It's another version of Bane.
Yeah, or even Mad Max, or
Well, how many lines did he have in Mad Max? Like 10?
Yeah, but he did a similar thing in that movie Lawless that he did with Shia LaBeouf back in like 2011 or so.
Exactly, and he mumbles through all of them.
I didn't really see what Hardy was going for. It felt familiar because obviously I'd seen him do similar stuff like it in many of his other roles. But the rest of the movie around the performance felt just totally limp, like I was not there for it. It felt like There just simply was not enough characters, not enough plot going on. I understood what Josh Trank was doing with it. He wanted to kind of show the decline and the, this once great gangster who's just been turned into basically a vegetable. And I really liked that one sequence where it's an extended flashback where Trank is using like a very selective use of color to kind of like have the degenerating version of Capone go back in time and kind of relive this crucial moment in his past. But other than that, it didn't feel like this movie was bringing anything really new to the table for me. But you're thinking that you actually liked it more than some other stuff. So I'm curious to know what you think.
Okay, so I just that was taken out of context. I only like it more than the Lovebirds.
Oh, okay. So low bar to clear. Okay.
I think what Josh Trank does really well in this movie is actually show like certain scenes where Al Capone's mental health and physical health is failing him. I think Josh Trank is really good at showing certain scenes. But I think what's missing in this film is the connective tissue that ties all the scenes together. Like, I can only see, so many scenes of Al Capone shitting his bed or yelling nonsense to people who aren't there before I get bored.
Yeah.
There's a subplot about how Al Capone had tucked away $10 million, and it becomes sort of like a point of contention between the characters that he imagines and real life characters who are there, who are like, his family's going through financial trouble. So there's a sense that they kind of know that he's hidden money somewhere. There's an FBI agent, I think FBI, who like accuses him of hiding money somewhere.
Yeah.
And Al Capone himself is kind of like paranoid about, where have I hidden this $10 million? I think that could have been fleshed out a bit more. That could have been the whole thing that ties everyone together. But instead, we get, a whole whack of scenes with Linda Cardellini and Tom Hardy just getting mad at each other.
Yeah, and I know you like Linda Cardellini, and you've liked, Tom Hardy gangster movies in the past. So, I mean, going into this, it felt like it could have been like a perfect movie for you, but it just didn't work.
Yeah, like you said, there's not a whole lot going on in between the years, figuratively and literally. I just think there are certain scenes that are really well done. I think this is what Josh Trank does, is that even if you look at Fantastic Four, there are certain scenes in there that are really, really well done. But he's always missing that overarching theme or overarching sort of plot to tie everything together. And you sent me this article. I think it was from, was it Collider or something like that?
I think it was Polygon, actually.
Polygon, sorry. Yes. And you could tell that this is a guy who has just spots of ideas, and they're usually really good ideas, but maybe it's just the way he is. He has a lot of trouble tying them together, and just the way he works seems to be all over the place. And I think as a result, his work suffers from it. And it feels very apparent in both this and Fantastic Four, in that these are just like really good scenes cobbled together. But because you have 10 good scenes, it doesn't mean you have like a sequence that makes sense.
Yeah, and that article I found, like, I thought it was pretty revelatory about his process too, because it kind of charts how
just smoke a lot of weed.
Yeah,
and play video games.
It charts how, like, Hollywood as a business and as a industry can chew people up. It can chew up promising young talents, because it follows him from his like early days, like making short films and familiarizing himself with editing. And he finally writes this script, Chronicle, which partnered with the pre-controversy Max Landis to get made, and it was this like just explosive thing for him. But even when he's recounting the making of Chronicle, which is this found footage superhero movie that, was a bit of a sleeper hit, even the process of bringing that to the screen was kind of fractious. And he had a version of the script written, and Landis came in and sort of rewrote it without permission. And that was the version that they sold the studio on. And so, the Chronicle as we know it is not like a out and out purely Trank product, but yet, he was kind of raised up as this hot young thing director, and Fox came along and they handed him the reins to Fantastic Four, and he just wasn't ready for it feels like he wasn't ready for the responsibility of such a huge budget and all these people depending on him to make important calls. He's kind of insecure about his own talents, and so when he perceives that people are criticizing him, he kind of freaks out a little bit. So that
he definitely brings a lot of this upon himself. Even though the studios like him, it's clear that he commits acts of sabotage for himself.
Yeah,
I think the other thing too is that I think it's become clear now that Chronicle was sort of like catching lightning in a bottle for him.
Yeah, big time.
If you look at all these like superhero movies, it's not necessarily that these directors, and I'm thinking specifically more of the Russo brothers, I don't think it's that they have like super original or like super cutting edge ideas of their own, like the Safdie brothers, but they are very good at managing things. And I think that's half of directing. Like you can have the best vision in the world, but if you can't cobble it together, if you can't bring it all together, if you can't manage it, then it's going to be a bad product. And I think that's what actually kind of happened with Star Wars too, is that it was just poorly managed from the beginning about the characters and the plot. And this kind of ties in with Trank, because at one point he was actually tied to the Star Wars franchise.
Yeah, they were going to give him I think it was going to be the Boba Fett spinoff movie.
Exactly. And I'm kind of glad that he's not there now, because if you look at what The Mandalorian did, it felt like it was a really well planned out series. And with these sort of IPs and with these sort of like big idea films, you really need someone who can pull it together, keep it together. And neither Josh Trank nor Tom Hardy really keep it together in this film.
No, there's there's some talk in that article about how they were almost ready to shoot it a few years before they did. And then,
right.
The scheduling got screwed up. Hardy wasn't available anymore. And Trank like freaked out because he had nothing left, right? He felt like he was in movie jail after the failure of Fantastic Four, and he was not going to work in the business anymore. And then a couple of years go by, he kind of makes ends meet by doing editing jobs and screenwriting jobs, and then he finally pulls this together. And I think a lot of people saw it as kind of like his possible like comeback story kind of thing, but I don't know that like you were saying, he's good at crafting individual scenes, but he hasn't really cracked the full like shape of a movie yet. And not to say that he won't ever. I mean, I'm partly trying to be nice to him because I know he's a rabid consumer of reviews, and he's one of these guys who deliberately goes out and reads everything that's written and said about him.
I don't think he'll listen to this, Rob. I think you're safe.
I know. But if he does, just know, Mr. Trank, I like parts of your filmmaking. I just think, keep on keeping on,
Yeah. And also the part with Matt Dillon, I thought that character could have been fleshed out a lot more. And I think he was by far the most interesting character because he personifies Al Capone's sort of like psyche.
Yeah. And he's like, at first he's introduced as like, he's somebody who actually is existing in the same timeline as what we're seeing for the majority of the movie. And then it's revealed, spoiler alert, that he's actually like a kind of like appearing to Capone as like a ghost of a previous like rival or somebody who Capone had to kill because he got in Capone's way.
Yeah. And there's some sort of backstory there because that the Matt Dillon's death is one of the scenes he flashes back to.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be like this turning point in Al Capone's life about how like he really had to kill someone that he really knew, and it affected him emotionally, obviously. But we never really like go anywhere with that thought.
No, we don't really understand fully the nature of their relationship or why, and we do.
A lot of it's implied. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other weird part is how they reveal Dylan's character at all. They open with him like on the phone as kind of like a fake out kind of thing to convince you that he's actually going down to Florida to see like present day Capone. But it becomes clear that it's a flashback later. But it felt a little bit clumsy to me. I wasn't sure why they had to fake us out like that.
It's hard to do because you always need that character reveal moment where you're like, oh, okay, I know now you're fake. And everything is a figment of imagination, and I am not mentally all there. Like A Beautiful Mind does a really good job with this, right? Where Russell Crowe's character at the end comes to the revelation himself that, okay, this guy is clearly non-existent and I'm schizophrenic. You kind of get that in Capone, but it's very heavily implied, and you kind of have to sit through his like sort of deterioration to really understand it.
I would say this movie is more interesting as like coming to an understanding of where Josh Trank is as a filmmaker. It's not something that you necessarily should seek out unless you're like super into Tom Hardy's filmography, or you just there's something driving you to it.
Tom Hardy's done some like good low budget films. This is not really one of them.
Maybe go back to like Tom Hardy on Peaky Blinders if you want. 1930s gangster Tom Hardy with, again, like a totally muffled vocal performance.
Even Legend was better than this, I think.
Yeah, I think so. There's a little bit more going on in Legend. So anyway, that brings us to a completely different genre with The Trip to Greece.
You're going to have to explain this to me. So from what I know, it's based on a British sitcom, but it's been edited to be into a movie.
Yeah. So this series is known just as The Trip. When it airs as a TV show, it's aired on the BBC since 2010. And over the past 10 years, since 2010, they've done 4 seasons, and each season has 6 episodes, I think. It's played out as a classic kind of like comedy drama kind of thing where Steve Coogan, who's a relatively well-known British comedian / actor, and his friend Rob Brydon, who's another British comic, less like Rob Brydon's filmography is not quite as outstanding as Coogan's. He hasn't been in as much stuff, but he's well known in England. The two of them are hired by a newspaper to do a tour of fancy restaurants, first in England and in the first season, and then in subsequent seasons they go to European locations, first in Italy, then Spain, and now in Greece. And they drive around, they dine at these 5-star restaurants, and the whole time they're just sort of getting on each other's nerves.
This is the 4th time we've been on one of these little jaunts.
We're retracing the steps of Odysseus.
Greeks were camped here 10 years. I can do a week tops with a pillow. I won't camp without a pillow. It's a shame we're getting the ferry. I would like to stay in the Hotel Lesbian.
Come, Mr. Bond. You like staying in the Hotel Lesbian just as much as I do.
If I can get my head down in the Lesbian, I'm more than happy.
If you're touring England for fancy restaurants, you would drive yourself nuts anyway. That's changed in recent years, but yeah.
Yeah, there's places in the Lake District where that first season is based that seem to be like, Michelin star level great. So, they're always hidden in like nondescript little cottages and you have to like go out of your way to find them.
Yeah, that's just the stereotype, right? Like how England has no good food. Although I've heard that it's really changed now because they have so many immigrants over the years. How is the plot pieced together? Like, is there a plot in the TV series that they kind of cobble into a plot for the film? Or is it like a travel show and then they somehow manufacture a plot out of it, which I think, admittedly, would be really impressive.
Well, what they've done is, I haven't actually seen any of the material as the TV show. I've always watched it in this other format that they've done for, it seems like predominantly North American audiences, where they take each season of the show and they cut it down from 6 episodes, I guess like 6 hours, down to about an hour, 45 minutes, and distribute that as a feature film. So basically they just construct the plots of each of the movies and presumably the TV series just around the travelogue aspect of it. The two guys get in the Land Rover and they drive to another restaurant and they have some great food and they do some celebrity impressions, and then they drive off to maybe a local tourist attraction. And
it'd be kind of like if Jerry Seinfeld's Driving in Cars with Comedians, or whatever that show is called, is cut into a film. That's what you're making it sound like.
A little bit, yeah. But the added level here is that Coogan and Brydon are not like, it's not a documentary series. So they are playing fictional or like slightly amplified versions of themselves. And they spend most of the time just sort of needling each other about, Coogan is this kind of preening, self-obsessed guy who, he likes to hold over his successes, his award nominations over Brydon's head. And he likes to lecture Brydon about, how knowledgeable he is about European history and literature and stuff like that. So they'll, go to some famous poet's cottage, and Coogan will wax poetic about, this person's accomplishments, and Brydon will just kind of roll his eyes and do a funny voice and kind of totally undercut the point of the visit. And it really is. It's just about their banter, and it's about seeing these wonderful meals being prepared in the kitchens. And the other part that you probably would never expect, both in the show and the movie, is how they work in this aspect of like melancholy and middle age.
Of course.
Like 75% of it will be mostly comedic. It'll just be them driving around, doing these great impressions. But then about 25% of it is them kind of wrestling with like, Steve Coogan's had a couple of marriages. He's always like, he's the one that's going to hook up with the waitress after their meal.
There's always like, yeah, I feel like the middle-age road trip coming of age story is its own sort of genre sometimes.
Yeah, but they don't like build out the stories too much. They kind of like, Brydon is the family guy, so he's not really interested in like chasing ladies around or anything like that. So they kind of, they compare and contrast those things. But, you see them like dealing with like, oh, they can't go, like they have an injury. They're kind of like old. They can't swim as far as they used to, or they're having trouble walking to the top of the hill to see the ancient ruin or whatever. And, and then they're dealing with like, they're getting on the phone occasionally and talking to their relatives back in England. And, the Steve Coogan's having trouble with his son in one of the earlier movies. And then in this one, it centers around Coogan finding out that his dad is very sick and in hospital. So that's the kind of melancholy background to their travels in Greece. And it's quite striking because you don't often see such a strange mix of like travelogue and drama and comedy and culinary adventure. It's pretty much, it's unlike anything else I've ever seen. And I mean, the impressions are so good. I highly recommend these things. One of my favorite moments is from the first movie or the first season. It's this extended bit where they're pretending to be like an ancient king and his servant trying to get up their soldiers for the morning, and I'll insert a clip. So here's a clip of it.
Death is but a moment. Cowardice is a lifetime of affliction.
Nice.
To bed, for we rise at daybreak.
Very good, very good, very impressive.
They always leave at daybreak, don't they? They never leave at, 9:30. Gentlemen, to bed, for we leave at 9:30. Ish. Gentlemen, to bed, for we rise at... What time's the battle? It's about 12 o'clock.
Yes.
Right, 12 o'clock. That was about on horseback. About 3 hours from something.
So that gives you a taste of what the trip is like. But I would recommend seeking them out. I think some of the earlier installments are on Netflix and Amazon Prime. This new one is, it's the theatrical cut down of the fourth season. So it's pretty new. It's available on VOD now. You can rent it from Google Play and iTunes and services like that.
Interesting. I'll have to look out for it. Speaking of interesting, you and I have both sort of worked and dabbled in media.
Yep.
Mainstream media. And Netflix has a new documentary series called Trial by Media. And what this is 6 one-hour episodes about famous trials, law trials that have been influenced by the media or have had media play some sort of role in it. This is a really interesting show. The saying is that the media always loves talking about itself. And this is one of those moments where Trial by Media is holding the court of public opinion on trial.
I found out early on as a lawyer, it doesn't matter about the law. It's about being able to tell a story.
When you turn a courtroom into a studio, you have to turn reality into a story with good guys, bad guys, drama.
And so what you have are these instances where the court of public opinion seems to supersede the actual law courts. And then here we are as viewers watching this and then holding them in the court of public opinion and then reacting to that. There's a bit of like meta-ness to it that I find very interesting.
Oh, yeah.
There's 6 episodes. So you've only watched 2 of them, I think you told me.
Yeah, the first one is about a murder that was kind of precipitated by this sort of embarrassment that happened on the Jenny Jones show, which was a daytime talk show, kind of like Jerry Springer, that aired in the 90s. And then the second episode is about this so-called subway vigilante who shot 4 unarmed black teenagers on a New York City subway car in 1984, and was then kind of like held up as, on one side he was a hero for standing up for, innocent New Yorkers who get mugged, and on the other side he was like a racist, crazy person who just wanted to, kill some black kids.
And in some instances, they talk about how the law courts and media sort of formed their relationship with each other. So for the talk show Murder, it talked about how much shows are liable for the actions of people who go on their show.
Yeah.
That's another theme that is discussed in King Richard, which is an episode about the CEO of a healthcare company who fights media with media, fire with fire. And then there's another one called Big Dan's, which is about the gang rape of a woman in Massachusetts and about how televised trials can change our opinion and what it says about us. But the interesting, I think, sort of aspect to me about the show is that even though they clearly say, look, media does have an influence, they're obviously guilty of certain things, but they always seem to come out on top anyway. But it never delivers a sentence on the effect of media. They never really outright say it's good or bad. In fact, they're really good at presenting both sides. But I wonder if it was interesting to you that they never sort of have the guilty verdict on media.
I wasn't quite sure if the documentary was going to take a side, if it was going to be. I worried a bit that it might actually take an anti-media stance where it would kind of end up sounding a bit like Trump's Twitter feed or something, where
which would have been really interesting because it is itself a form of media.
Exactly, yeah. So I wasn't, if it had gone that route, I think I would have found it a little bit harder to stick to. But you're right, it does keep it pretty even keeled. And it
never condemns itself.
No, and I think it probably would have kind of been in a tricky kind of ethical situation anyway if it had said that, like, well, the news media is bad, but we as the documentary producers are totally good.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thesis behind this is that, look, this media thing, totally new tool, especially with all the technology that comes in. And more often than not, like any tool, we often misuse it first before we learn how to use it properly. And you could extrapolate this to like the big data stuff right now, right? Like we create all this sort of great social media technology, but it gets out of hand and we don't know how to control it.
Yeah.
And we're always behind the 8 ball on this. This is kind of the same thing, except it's just the advent of TV media, the advent of like those trash TV talk shows like Sally Jesse Raphael, Jerry Springer, all that stuff. But it is interesting to look back at it 20 years later and sort of point out the point where it really got out of hand. Like we're 30, 40 years out from some of the events in these documentary series. And it just seems like just now we understand how disruptive and how destructive media can be, especially in things that should be objective, like the court of law.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you see how, like, in the Jenny Jones episode, the first one, how there's a small detail about the existence of this court TV network in the U.S., which is,
I remember that as a kid. Actually,
it's a concept that's pretty foreign to me, like living in Canada. But I'm sure you can watch it in Canada if you want to. But it's an actually like surprisingly produced set of programming where not only do you actually see the live feeds of the court proceedings, but they cut back to anchors in a studio who are bringing on guests to comment on, do you think the prosecutor is doing a good job on this one today? Oh, I don't know. It sounds like the defense attorney has got one over on him in this particular piece of the trial. And like, that's something you'd never see in Canada. Canada, it's always presented as like, closed door, the most you ever see from the inside of a courtroom are the courtroom sketches by the authorized artist,
Right. We don't treat our courtrooms the same way, but we kind of have the same thing with the legislate.
Oh yeah, like the feed from inside the House of Commons or inside the...
Yes, the House of Commons stuff, yes. So they televise that live. The only difference is that we are not really putting people on trial and we are not reacting to it right away with analysts. For the most part, those House of Commons televised things are the most boring things you could ever watch.
Yeah, there's a lot of ceremony and...
Exactly. So I think the biggest thing is that they tend to like... I don't think they sensationalize anything. It's just they make it so that you have to take a side.
Yeah.
They turn up the drama, and especially with the lawyers that are sort of in these trials. I mean, they are really putting on a show.
Oh, yeah.
They're not just arguing a case of facts. They are seriously, I think, if you watch the King Richard episode and then the Jenny Jones episode, they have lawyers who basically, like one of them was like, I think a former drama student.
Yeah.
And he ends up being a lawyer and he makes the whole thing a freaking theater.
Yeah. Well, there's a guy in the Jenny Jones episode who feels like, the...
Feiger, that's his name. Yeah, he's a former drama student.
He feels like partly the inspiration for Saul Goodman.
Yes.
Just in like the garishness of his office and the plastic surgery and the hair and the suits and everything.
He's, I think, arguably like the star of the show. If you go back and watch it, I would recommend King Richard's episode. The lawyer in that with the pancake analogy is hilarious. I think it's great. And it's also just a very interesting story in general. I found the Subway Vigilante one about Bernie Goetz a little... I think it was the most boring one of them all.
Yeah, I wasn't as fired up about that, yeah.
No, I don't think it made any huge revelations other than the fact that we were shown continuously clips of this guy who is clearly just mentally ill.
Yeah.
And I think it brought about, certain topics about racism and racial profiling. Went into a little about Rudy Giuliani and broken windows theory, but it never really went anywhere. It felt, in fact, more like a documentary about the event itself and not the media.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I agree with that.
Like the other episodes do.
It's worth thinking a bit some of the producers attached to Trial by Media, because you've got George Clooney and Grant Heslov. Of course, Clooney's famous as an actor, but these days he's been more of a producer role and he's been working.
He's always had a political slant too, right?
Yeah, him and Heslov have worked together on countless projects. But then the other producer's name who stepped out of the credits for me was Jeffrey Toobin, who's been a legal pundit on CNN for years and years.
Yes.
And he's also, in recent years, especially in the Trump years, he's been taking more of a progressive tone in his criticism too. So it's kind of notable that they have these kind of progressive voices as the producers, but yet for the most part, it seems like the tone of this is still pretty balanced, like you were saying.
Which is, I think, a good thing if you want it to be like as a piece of journalism. I don't know if it's going to generate much debate because, like I said, it doesn't really take either side. But I think it's hard to not watch this and be at times angry about how the media sort of manipulates things and uses us.
Yeah.
Which is just like half the things we talked about in journalism school. Like every other day we have this conversation about what is journalism? What does it do? How is it presented? If you're interested in it, it's a really good series. I hope there's more episodes. I think there are a lot more instances to come, especially now in like the social media universe. Like I feel like in 20 years from now, you can make the same series with social media and it'd be just as compelling, if not more. But I feel like we've also taken a lot of your time. So I feel like probably want to get to, looking up stuff about the Snyder Cut or watching the Lovebirds or Capone or Trip to Greece or Trial by Media.
Yeah. So with that being said, as usual, head on over to kinetoscope.ca to check out some of the expanded versions of what we were talking about here on the show today.
If you're listening, please like, rate, or subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us via email, extrabutterypod@gmail.com.
But until the next episode, my name is Robert Snow in Toronto.
And my name is Jason Chen in Vancouver. And we'll talk to you next time.